All right, let's get started. We are on lecture 25, and we'll be getting through the last couple papers of the course, the last couple topics, dealing with some current issues and some future prospects in Africa. I mentioned last time that next Thursday the class will still be here, but we'll be streaming in the keynote talk and a couple talks afterwards from the SIGA Symposium focusing on African agriculture. I'm excited about it too, just like these guys. I like that. And Andrew Yoon will be the keynote speaker, and he's featured in one of your readings. After the keynote, Marshall Burke will be speaking, and you guys saw him already. And then it turns out, actually, the speaker, we've kind of set it up. So the speaker after Marshall, which will be around 4:30, is Marcel Fafchamp, who will be discussing mobile technology and African agriculture. And he'll actually be covering the Jenny Aker 2010 paper that's on your reading list. So it all kind of came together. And the papers that are on the reading list will be very much featured there. What I wanted to mention is in the last 15 minutes or so of that lecture, 4:45 to 5, I'm going to ask Pierre and Jonas to lead a discussion of what you guys will have just heard in the previous hour or so, to any questions that came up, there may be some content that was unfamiliar, or just people's reactions to some of it, because it is a bit of a capstone sort of to a lot of what we've been discussing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, the whole thing is going to be streamed live, I believe. It'll definitely be recorded and posted. And then you can, for the times that aren't here, you can attend there. You can try to attend there if you want and not attend it here. That's okay. It's just that I think I think they've capped out on registration. Now, on the day of, some people who register don't show up, so there's always going to be some seats. So that's an alternative. It goes from like 1 to 5:30, I think, something like that. For your what, sir? Oh, I see. Oh, yeah. No, that's a good question. Because there's like only a few papers left, and 2 of them are going to be directly covered during the symposium, during the exact time of this class. That material is certainly something that could be on the final. So the Jenny Aker paper and then the Roger Thoreau chapter. So there's going to be a pretty tight link between what's going on here and what's going to be covered, I think. But no clickers. You don't have to bring your clickers that day. Yeah. Yeah. So this is going to be at the Berkeley Art Museum on Bancroft. So not too far away from here. If there is a lot of overflow during the period of the time of this class at that time, they may send 10 or 20 people down here to fill in some of the seats to stream to watch it here. So I don't know. We'll see if that even happens or not, but that's the idea. Any other questions? All right. Let's get going. Last time we were discussing foreign aid and how effective foreign aid is or isn't, and we got halfway into this last time. We talked about these really polarized views about structural adjustment programs. This move starting in the mid-'80s and then into the 1990s to by the World Bank, the IMF, and other donors to only offer aid and loans if countries fulfilled certain conditions, liberalizing their economies, dismantling agricultural marketing boards, reducing inflation, et cetera. And let's continue discussing Ghana. Again, we got like halfway through last time. Remember, we were talking a lot about agriculture in Ghana in particular. We mentioned cocoa and the fact that there was an agricultural marketing board for cocoa that had something like 48,000 employees before structural adjustment. And within a few years of the reform starting, it had been cut down to 10,000 employees. It was no longer a monopoly. There were dozens of other buyers of cocoa. The whole market for cocoa, the major agricultural export of Ghana, had been completely changed within a few years as a result of the structural adjustment programs. What were some benefits? Again, this is right around where we left off. Clearly, if government expenses are cut back and various bureaucracies, agricultural marketing boards, et cetera, are reduced, you're going to have a smaller budget deficit. That was the hope, and that happened. And inflation also fell. So we mentioned last time that governments facing huge deficits can do a few things. You guys know this from macro. You can raise taxes, you can cut spending, you can borrow, or you can just print money. So by the early 80s, there was just a lot of printing money going on among African economies in crisis. But in Ghana, within a few years of structural adjustment, inflation fell dramatically, and that was true of most other African countries. There was much less inflation by the late 90s, say, than there had been in the early to mid 80s. So very few hyperinflations, lots of single-digit inflation, just very stable prices. So that was a benefit. It's a lot easier to make economic decisions when you have a stable price environment. What also happened, and this is why Ghana got so much attention, was after having had negative growth from the 60s into the 80s, shortly after the start of structural adjustment, economic growth in Ghana became positive. So remember, we mentioned that, we talked about this so much, especially early in the course, that African growth rates around 2000 became positive again after having been negative for a few decades, and they've been pretty positive and fast growth since then. Ghana was one of the early countries to make that turnaround. So in the 1990s already, they were having positive growth. There was growth in new sectors. So not only did cocoa do much better, after all the reforms in the cocoa sector, not only did cocoa production go up, not only did the incomes of cocoa farmers go up, which was really important, all kinds of new agricultural production got started. There was a growing industry of fresh fruit exports to Europe. So if you're in Ghana in West Africa, Europe is just due north of you, and you can fly a plane in not too many hours to some of the largest economies of the world. This actually has become a very lucrative sector in Ghanaian agriculture. So there were these changes, and incomes increased for poor farmers. So there were some clear benefits to some of these reforms. Did I see a hand up, or was that a phantom hand? Okay, I just was imagining it. I turned, and I thought I saw it. Okay. What are some of the downsides? Dismantling the Agricultural Marketing Board could have some downsides. So the Agricultural Marketing Board was supposed to set stable prices for Ghanaian farmers. Well, they may have set them too low before, and we know they did, but they might have set them better. So there's this possibility that, maybe dismantling the board wasn't the right thing to do. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. The market led to higher prices, but more volatile prices. So now Ghanaian farmers are subject to the whims of the world market. If cocoa prices are really high one year, really low the other year, basically that passes directly back onto them, and there's no government body that can insure them against those shocks. So it's a potential downside that they face this variability. A question I want you to ask yourself is, were agricultural marketing boards reformed too soon and too much? We know that Ghana and many other African countries are much more democratic today than they were in the 70s and 80s. The policy environment's different. There are competitive parties, there are competitive elections, there's a free media in Ghana. Ghanaian elections are considered some of the fairest elections in Africa with multiple strong parties. Maybe today, with more accountability, monitoring, and political competition, maybe marketing boards wouldn't be abused as much as they were before. Maybe now marketing board officials that try to squeeze farmers would be checked by the press, by voters, et cetera. So we don't have an answer to this question, but maybe these boards would have functioned differently today. Maybe they would have given farmers higher prices. Imagine I'm a politician in a very close democratic election, and we're only giving farmers, cocoa farmers, 70 cents on the dollar for the world price, or 60 cents on the dollar. Well, if I'm a smart politician and I want to get votes in the cocoa growing region, I'll raise that to 80 cents on the dollar. Sure, I'll take a little bit less of a tax from the farmers, but I'll get some votes. So there might be some pressure for better economic policy in a democracy that did not exist before. Another thing that's often mentioned about a downside of losing the marketing board is there's a claim, a number of economists have made this claim, that it's actually harder to get credit in rural areas now than it was before. Marketing boards used to offer tons of credit. Why could they do that? Why could they offer credit where other people couldn't? Well, they were the monopoly buyer. If I offered you credit, I knew I could get paid back, because I knew you'd have to sell your crop to me. So there was no problem of repayment. Basically, if you screwed me over and didn't repay the loan, well, I don't have to buy your crop in the future. I could punish a farmer who didn't sort of pay back a loan. So that may be too much power for one body to have, but they certainly had the power to enforce credit contracts before. Today, when you have dozens of private buyers, that punishment doesn't work anymore. You as one buyer could offer me credit, but I could sell to somebody else. I could renege on my contract with you, and there's not much they can do about it. So this is a potential downside that's been mentioned. Can people think of other potential downsides just on the pure economic policy side? Pricing, credit. Yeah. So you're saying there's more competition for Ghanaian farmers? Explain how the subsidies would work. Oh, I see. Okay, so what you're saying is maybe before, if you had a marketing board and there were a temporary drop in prices because another country was dumping product on the world market, maybe the marketing board could insure farmers against that shock, but now they can't. Basically, they're subject to the whim of the global price. I mean, one thing that's worked out well for Ghanaian farmers since around 2000 or 2002 is global commodity prices have been really high in historical terms. So even though they haven't had the marketing board, they haven't had to worry too much about low prices. So maybe we haven't seen the downside of not having a marketing board that much recently. Maybe we'll see it in the future if commodity prices fall more. Yeah. Yeah. If we're going to contrast the market to the marketing board, we have to know what the marketing board was doing. And the truth is, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, marketing board policy shifted around a lot. So if it were like truly pegged and it was consistent, then you'd have that kind of, you'd have less variability. But in reality, marketing board policies were changing too. So probably the reality of the marketing board from the 60s to the 80s was certainly worse than the market, just because farmers were getting squeezed with low prices and it was very variable. So at least now they're getting something close to the world price. Even if it's variable, they're getting something close to the world price. The question is, could we imagine a better marketing board, which is just how agriculture works in the U.S. U.S. farmers get predictable prices. Basically, there's the way farm subsidies work is there are price floors that operate for U.S. farmers. And if prices fall further than that, all these subsidies kick in for U.S. farmers. And that's sort of what we could imagine a marketing board looking like in sub-Saharan Africa. A price floor. You maybe get a little bit of variability, but you can't get less than a certain price that's pre-announced. So I guess all I'm saying is you could imagine marketing boards in Africa working like boards in the U.S. or Europe and stabilizing prices a bit more. Yeah, Robert. No, there's dozens of private sector buyers that go around and collect crop. And sometimes the farmers themselves will join into cooperatives to sort of assemble crop and then try to get better deals with the buyers. Sometimes it's much more individual. But there's just dozens of buyers going out trying to grab as much cocoa as they can. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We always talk about the benefits of competition, and there certainly are some. A downside of having dozens of companies going around is they're spending tremendous amounts of effort and energy trying to find people to sell that'll sell to them. I, as a farmer, have to decide between all these buyers. That takes a lot of time. There have been studies, and this is a very active area of research and policy discussion. It's a different area, but it's a kind of similar issue. A number of countries have privatized their old age pension systems. And instead of having Social Security like we have in the US, they have tons of private pension companies, and they're regulated by the government. They have to meet some conditions. But they spend a lot of their budgets basically on advertising and marketing and competing for customers. And customers have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what plan is right for them or wrong for them. And that takes a lot of time and energy. I mean, that's wasteful compared to just having a monopoly. So a competitive environment has advantages, but it introduces all this extra energy and effort to make the market work, which may not always be positive. Yeah. Yeah. Inflation fell, and that's very closely related to budget deficits falling. So when budget deficits are large, Ghana and lots of African countries basically they paid their debts by printing money. And that generates lots of inflation. And once the budget deficit falls, they don't have to do it. Yeah. So this has been an evolving area, and there's been a lot of innovation just in the last few years using mobile technology to try to help farmers in Ghana and elsewhere understand what the real market price is for their commodity. So in many African countries, NGOs and governments are starting to experiment with online clearinghouses and price postings and things like that. So I think the environment's getting better now because it's easier for people to access information. But again, 10 years ago when few people had cell phones, maybe not so much. In the Jenny Aker paper that you'll hear about next Thursday and it's on your reading list, she talks about how important cell phone access is for people to just understand what market prices are. So again, if there are very few buyers, imagine you replace a marketing board with private buyers, and I as an isolated farmer know very little about the market price, and very few buyers come to my town, or the buyers collude. The buyers say, you know what, you get that town, I'll get this town. We'll each be local monopolists. It could be that farmers do worse under the non-marketing board setting, because there's no real competition locally. So, this again has been a big area of discussion. If you replace a public monopoly with private monopolies, maybe that's the worst of all possible worlds. Martin? Exactly. Yep. Exactly, and that's potentially the greatest value of the marketing board, is these price floors or price stability, which provides insurance. It's just another way of thinking of insurance. Exactly. That's exactly right. Okay. There's another set of arguments against structural adjustment, and I think it's worth thinking about them. A lot of the rhetoric and the discussion against these structural adjustment programs, meaning big donors saying, hey, we're only going to lend you money if you do X, Y, Z, revolve around the political implications of this. What does it mean for a poor country of a few million people when they face a major international institution with billions of dollars in hand? And that international institution is conditioning relief on fundamental policy changes. Relief that political leaders can hardly afford not to get if you're in the middle of a major economic crisis. Is conditionality a form of neocolonialism? That's something that's been raised. Is it a violation of sovereignty? Does any international body have the right to force poor countries, if that's the word that's used, to adopt certain reforms? Now, the counter argument to this would be to say nobody needs to take World Bank or IMF money. No one needs to take foreign aid. So maybe this argument doesn't hold. Maybe it's fine. Anybody can offer loans or grants with whatever conditions they want, rich countries or poor countries. But there's certainly something that feels unjust or unfair to a lot of people about poor countries getting bullied or getting pushed into certain policies that have little local political support in exchange for economic survival or an economic lifeline. So this has been in the debate a lot. There's a different but related point, which is to say, even if we don't think that conditionality is a violation of sovereignty, maybe foreigners just have no right imposing conditions because they're just going to get it wrong. How can foreigners come into a country not knowing the local politics and history and policy environment? How can they come in with any credibility and make all these sweeping economic policy prescriptions? How do they know what makes sense for Ghana versus Tanzania versus Botswana, et cetera? And there have been a lot of stories about this and discussion. Bill Easterly went to Ghana in the 1980s for the World Bank. He was in his late 20s. No offense against people in their 20s, but he had just finished his PhD. He was an American who'd always lived in America, got a PhD in an American institution, learned lots of great theoretical economics, and then was told, hey, apply all this in Ghana. How do we know that those models make sense in Ghana? How do we know that they make political sense or social sense, or they are sort of locally compatible with the economic reality in Ghana? So the critique that basically folks are sent with very little local knowledge to impose policy on foreign countries also feels unfair to a lot of people. Or even if it isn't unfair, it feels like it's going to lead to bad policy. What if 27-year-old economists from Brazil were responsible for crafting economic policy in the U.S.? That would seem unfair and kind of undemocratic and wrong-headed in some ways. So Ghanaians felt the same way. Why is Bill Easterly here? Any other thoughts or comments on these issues? Do these ideas resonate with any of you guys, or are they really overstated because countries could always refuse the loans anyway? I mean, no one literally forced them. So is this all just rhetoric, or is there something to this? Yeah. People often point to these kinds of conditions as one of the reasons why there has been so much engagement with Chinese investors, as you said. That the idea is that Chinese infrastructure companies or other investors, people building roads or railroads, et cetera, don't impose conditions. They're like, hey, there's just an investment here we want to make, or there's foreign aid we want to give to the country. Now, there may be other forms of exchange and quid pro quo in those deals, but they typically don't involve economic liberalization or major economic reforms. There may be other aspects of the deal. So there's a condition of a deal, but it won't be fundamental economic reform. Chinese foreign aid is considered less ideological in that sense than some of the kind of Western aid. Yeah. Yeah. I see what you're saying. So now if there's a track record, and it's like, we did structural adjustment, it worked, yeah, maybe it's sort of a violation of sovereignty, but it really improves lives, maybe it's worth doing, right? At the time, there wasn't really a track record. It was more of a leap of faith, right? Okay, so that's an interesting point. Again, I think the research literature is very split on what the effects are of structural adjustment, but that would be a justification for it. And any what, sorry? Okay, so the local political implications of these loans are important, and there's a kind of funny dynamic that occurs. There certainly were cases of governments that knew they couldn't run budget deficits forever. They couldn't accumulate infinite amounts of debt. They couldn't keep printing money. They realized that marketing boards had flaws, et cetera. Some of these reforms almost had to be done. You can't just have hyperinflation year after year. But if you're a local government official, and you can blame, you can say, well, these foreigners made me do it. I hate them. IMF, terrible people. It's not my fault. It's their fault. They forced us to do it. It's neo-colonial. Like, the more you can play out that rhetoric, the more you defend yourself against the consequences of the action. So the question that emerges is how much of the rhetoric against these structural adjustment programs was generated because it was actually very politically beneficial for local politicians. Sure, some didn't want to implement the reform. Some might have wanted to. But either way, you could kind of get off the hook for it if you could blame foreigners for it. I think that's a question that's sort of lingering around these things. There were several very prominent African economists working in the World Bank and IMF who were involved in some programs, some of whom have become major economic policy leaders in their home countries. So there were some sort of high-profile, well-known cases. And there's the central bank governor of Tanzania, Ben Ndulu, was one of them. And there are others. He has a US PhD, but ended up working in, I think, the World Bank, and now is working in Tanzania. So there were at least a handful of sort of prominent bank economists who were Africans who were involved in crafting some of the programs. But it is fair to say that the vast majority of the technical staff in the bank and the IMF were non-Africans, for sure. So it's a mix, but the way you're characterizing is right, that there weren't too many African economists. The point I want to get to next is Easterly's point. So Easterly's point is actually a little different than this. He's saying, this debate and all these political points, they're interesting, but they're kind of all wrong. Because conditionality was actually never imposed. So again, it's a little bit like this rhetoric point. There were some political changes, some governments had to change policy, but it wasn't due to the conditionality. The conditionality was sort of like a roadmap of like, here are some potentially useful economic policy reforms, but if you didn't fulfill those conditions, you still got the next loan from the World Bank or the IMF. Conditionality only bites if you get cut off from loans if you don't fulfill the conditions, and no one ever got cut off from loans. That's Easterly's point. So what he's saying is politically, countries had to make reforms. They blame the IMF and the World Bank, and yeah, they did some of the reforms, they didn't do others, but it wasn't really due to the World Bank program. So he cites countries, Zambia and Ivory Coast are extreme cases, and I'll show you a map in a second. The average African country received 6 loans, some countries received double-digit loans. He talks about the case of the railroads in Kenya. In the 1980s and 90s, the government of Kenya received 3 large loans to facilitate the privatization of their railroads.